So Luke 2 is a wonderful chapter that we're all really familiar with because we read it in the Christmas season, all about the gift of Jesus to this world and into our lives. So we're very familiar with it. We may not necessarily read it during Lent, but in Lent it speaks to us about God's great gift to us and of Jesus laying aside his heavenly role to come to earth as a human being. And this is very important for us in Lent. Often we will lay something aside during Lent, we will give something up, and maybe it's that reminder to us of our dependence upon God and on God's gift to us. And Luke 2 puts us in touch with that gift that is Jesus, and it gives us that thankfulness. I think this is another aspect of Lent, that when we give something up, we're reminded of God's sustaining, and therefore it develops gratitude in us or thankfulness for all God's gifts to us. So I remember experiencing God's generosity unexpectedly at around the time when I had been through a selection conference to go to train for ordination, and I was going to be training in a residential college. And at that time, I was a teacher in London, and I was living in a house share with others in a rented home in West London. And I was going to be leaving my job and giving up that place where I lived to go and train in this residential college. But it didn't really run anything through the holidays, and there was no way that I could afford to keep on my house where I was living. And I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to stay in an empty college. I didn't even know if that was possible. But a friend in my church, an older friend, who actually I'd known for some time, but we'd ended up worshipping in this church at the same time, she and her husband said to me, "We have a spare room that we don't use, and we would really like it to be Jackie's room, and we'd like our home to be Jackie's home if you would welcome that." Which was just the most wonderful gift, and it was. And I had a home to go to in London, back with my friends at those times, and that was just the most generous gift. So God's gifts, in my experience, come often through other people's generosity, God's Spirit at work in them. I don't quite know what prompted that offer, but I was so grateful. So I think generosity produces a kind of virtuous cycle of generosity. So God's generosity to us, I think this is something that is helpful for us always to be reminded about, that we swim in this generosity of God. And God is not a God of scarcity. And often in the church, we tell ourselves stories of scarcity, that we don't have enough people for this, we don't have enough young people, we don't have enough money, this kind of scarcity story that we live with. And we need to instead receive that generosity of God, which tells me that God will provide, that there will be enough, that God's purposes are being worked out, and that God's very being, God's character, is to give and to give. And the Trinity shows us this giving to the other in the Trinity. And this is something about our life in the church. So it calls out then generosity in us. So what is it that I have to offer in this time? What gift might God be giving to me to use in his service and for the church? Is God asking me to give more from my finances or use my gifts in a different way? So God's generosity calls out a generosity in us. And sometimes that generosity can just be great fun. How can I help somebody the way that I was helped when I was a young person, not knowing where I was going to live? It calls out that generosity and gift in us, and that joy of making a difference for somebody else by being generous with what God has given. I think Lent is an invitation to trust in God again. Lent is a time when we may reflect on that desert experience that Jesus had. And it's a time to reflect on God's provision even in the hard times. I think that Lent also is an invitation to thankfulness, to realize that our life, our very breath, depends on God, and to take those moments in Lent to pause and to be thankful, to notice the things that we do have and that God has given, to be attentive to God's generosity in our lives and in our church, and to pause and give thanks.